Good evening. A place to soothe your weary day. This is Slow Night, Ancient Tales. The story we will share with you tonight is a record of a young man who sought to become a light himself amidst the pitch-black darkness of the Japanese colonial period. It is a turbulent youth, a chapter from the Baekbeomilji, the Diary of Baekbeom, by Baekbeom Kim Gu. The 21-year-old youth, Kim Chang-soo, avenging the Queen Mother, and his fiery spirit that was never broken even in a cold prison. Tonight we bring this to you in a calm voice. Now lay down your heavy burdens for a moment, close your eyes, and let us embark together into the distant night of history. Please sit back and listen comfortably. A turbulent youth. The very day before I decided to set off on a wandering journey towards the Qing Empire, I visited Jinsa An's guest room to see him one last time and silently express my farewells, where I met a fine-tooth comb seller. No matter how I looked at him, his speech and demeanor did not seem like that of an ordinary person. When I asked for his introduction, he said he was Kim Hyung-jin from Gwitgol, Namwon, in Jeolla Province, of the same Andong Kim clan as myself, and about 8 or 9 years my senior. I told him I would buy a comb and brought him to my house, where we spent the night together, allowing me to gauge his character. Indeed, he was no ordinary comb seller. He said he had purposely set out to visit Jinsa An after hearing that he was a great writer and hero of the time. Though his character was not particularly outstanding, nor his knowledge profound, he seemed to harbor dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs and possessed a determination to do something about it. The next day I took him to Teacher Go and asked for his assessment of the man's character. The teacher judged that although he might not be a man fit to be a leader, he seemed to have the aptitude to assist others in their endeavors. Thus, I decided to make Mr. Kim my traveling companion, sold a horse I had been raising at home to fund our travel expenses, and departed for the Qing Empire. Second, tour of Pyongan and Hamgyong provinces and local customs. We decided to see Mount Baekdu, travel around the 3 eastern provinces, namely Manchuria, and head to Beijing. We traveled as usual up to Pyongyang, and from there, I too decided to disguise myself as a peddler of fine-tooth combs and miscellaneous goods, just like Kim Hyung-jin. We bought combs, writing brushes, inkstones, and other goods that might sell in mountain towns, and each strapped a load to our backs. Leaving Pyongyang, we briefly toured Yeolmildae and Moranbong, passed through Gangdong, Yangdeok, and Mangsan, crossed over into Hamgyong Province, and arrived at the Hamhung Provincial Office via Gowon and Jeongpyeong. While sleeping for a night at a marketplace in Gangdong, I was beaten for no apparent reason by a 70-year-old drunkard, which led us to laugh as we talked about how Han Xin had been humiliated by a young thug in Huaiyin. At Hamgwanryong in Gowon, we saw the victory monument erected by King Taejo for defeating the Mohe tribe, and in Hamhung, we saw the Namdaecheon wooden bridge, said to be the longest in Korea, and a Jangsong, village guardian post, one of the 4 great things. This Jangsong had a human face carved into a large tree, wearing a Samo, official's hat, on its head, painted vermilion on its face, and glaring with its eyes, looking very majestic. 2 Jangsongs stood at the head of the Namdaecheon bridge. In the old days, Jangsong stood everywhere at major crossroads, but the one in Hamhung was famous for being the largest, counted as one of the 4 great objects along with the bell of Gyeongju, the stone Maitreya of Yunjin, and the iron cauldron of Yeonsan. The Nangminu Pavilion in Hamhung, built by King Taejo, still remained as it was. In Hongwon and Sinpo, we watched the catching of Polak, and I was surprised to see a sturdy woman carrying a basket with a single blue crab on her head with all her might, the legs of the crab thicker than my forearms. What impressed me most upon entering Hamgyong Province was that the educational system was more developed than in Hwanghae or Pyongan provinces. No matter how poor a village consisting only of thatched houses was, the study hall, Seoje, and the village hall, Dochong, were tile-roofed buildings. At a certain study hall in Hongwon, I saw 3 teachers dividing the curriculum into higher, middle, and lower levels, each taking charge of 1 class. This was a rare occurrence for old Sodangs, village schools. On the left and right of the main hall of the Sodang Hu, a drum and a bell. Beating the drum started the reading of texts, and striking the bell signaled a break. Moreover, Bukchong was a town in Hamgyong province that revered scholarship so much that even when I passed through, there were over 30 living jinsus, literary licentiates, and 7 officials who had passed the highest civil service examination. I deeply admired it, thinking it was truly a hometown of literature. The village hall is a building used publicly by the village. It is both larger and more splendid than ordinary houses. At night, people would gather here to discuss village affairs, twist straw ropes, make straw shoes, listen to stories, and play. Also, if a guest visited any house in the village, the host would only serve meals at home and have the guest sleep at the village hall. It was, so to speak, a communal guest room, an inn, and a public hall. If a penniless traveler arrived, meals were provided from the village hall's budget. I thought of all these as beautiful customs to be emulated. Third, suspension of the trip to Mount Baekdu and wandering in Manchuria. It was July of the Yulmi year, 1895, when we crossed Maolyong in Dancheon and arrived at Gapsan town. What surprised me here was that, except for government buildings roofed with tiles, every house had grass growing thickly on its roof, looking like empty lots where no one lived. However, I learned later that if they pressed down birch bark covering the roof with lumps of clay, grass would grow thickly there, and no matter how heavily it rained, the soil wouldn't wash away. The birch bark is white, smooth, and hard, lasting longer than tiles. It is said that if a dead person is wrapped in birch bark and buried, the skeleton will not scatter, even after 10,000 years. Upon reaching Hyesanjin, a place that looks across to Manchuria with the Yalu River in between, we could hear dogs barking from the Chinese houses on the opposite side. The Yalu River there was shallow enough to cross on foot. Jeshendang in Hyesanjin is located at the foot of Mount Baekdu, the origin of our country's mountain ranges, and has been a place where the state sent officials since ancient times to offer sacrifices to heaven and the deity of Mount Baekdu. Around it, it was written like this: Yuolseol Seksam Baekdu Yunmu Mango Yusong Swamnoki Yongyong. On the snow-covered Mount Baekdu in June, clouds and mist linger. The Yalu River, flowing ceaselessly for eternity, surges up. Asking for directions to Mount Baekdu, we crossed Sodaryong, passed through Samju, Zhongjin, and Huchang, crossed Jungang and Jasong, and reached Malsan in Chinese territory. The path we took was exclusively through rugged mountains and steep passes. In some places, there were stretches of 70 to 80 arai without a soul, so we sometimes had to pack our own food. The mountains were extremely steep, but there were few wild beasts, and the forests were often so dense that we couldn't distinguish things close by. It was said that it was not rare to find tree stumps so large that 7 or 8 people could sit on one to eat a meal. Among the things I saw, there was a grown man standing inside a log, chopping with an axe to hollow it out into a grain storage bin. A spectacular sight was when a tree standing on one mountain peak had fallen and rested on another peak, and we used it as a bridge to cross. The people in these parts were exceedingly kind and generous, and food was plentiful. When travelers arrived, they welcomed them warmly, let them stay as long as they wanted, and then sent them off. The crops were mostly oats and potatoes, and the mountain streams were full of atka mackerel, which was incredibly delicious. Using animal skins for clothing seemed quite primitive. In the town of Samsu, there were barely 30 civilian houses. On the road heading northwest from Malsan, crossing the pass called Noinchi again and again towards Seodaryong, we met only a couple of our compatriots over a distance of 100 rai, most of whom were gold miners. Everyone we met told us not to go to Mount Baekdu because it was dangerous due to the local bandits, Shangmadi. So regrettably, we gave up our pilgrimage to Mount Baekdu. We then changed direction and went to Tonghua, thinking we would tour Manchuria instead. Tonghua, like other county seats along the Yalu River, had not been established long, so the rafters of the official residences and the fortress pavilions had not yet lost their white color. They said there were 500 houses within the fortress walls, among which was one house belonging to a Korean. The man wore a queue, looking like a Chinese person, and worked as an interpreter at the county office, but his wife and children wore our traditional clothes. Having heard that a compatriot named Scholar Sim lived about 10 ri away, we went to find him. only to discover he was a man who mindlessly consumed opium. The most despicable things we encountered while wandering through Manchuria were the Hotongza, corrupt interpreters. Having learned a few words of Chinese, they scratched the backs of their poor compatriots to suck their blood. Our compatriots had fled the Donghak peasant revolution in the Gabo year, 1894, crossed over to this unfamiliar land, and chose the rugged mountain valleys abandoned by the Chinese to clear fields and barely survive by farming millet or corn. Those bastards called Hotongsa clung to the Chinese and fabricated unreasonable excuses to steal the grain and wealth of our compatriots or violate the chastity of the women. While passing through a certain place, I saw a young woman wearing hanbok in a Chinese person's house. When I asked a neighbor, I was told she too had been dragged to the Chinese house as payment for her parents' debt due to the machinations of a Hotongsa. Whether in Guandian, Linjiang, or Huanren, the evils of the Hotongsas were the same everywhere. Everywhere, the land was fertile, so much so that what one person farmed could feed 10. The only precious commodity was salt, which was said to be carried up against the current from Uiju on people's backs. The hearts of our compatriots were truly pure and generous. When someone from the homeland arrived, they rejoiced as if their own blood relative had come from the southern regions. Every house competed to serve delicious food, and men, women, young and old gathered around to beg for stories from the homeland. Most were refugees from the Sino-Japanese War, but occasionally there were people who had committed crimes in the homeland and fled. Among them were heroes who had been leaders in peasant uprisings and local officials who had embezzled public funds. It was a pity that I did not see the stele of King Gojong the Great in Jian because I did not know about it at the time. But I was glad to see the monument pavilion of General Im Gyeong-eop in Gwandian. Carved on the face of the monument was monument of the loyal subject of the three kingdoms, Im Gyeong-eop. It is said that the Chinese in this region have a custom of offering sacrifices at this pavilion when they fall ill. Fourth, becoming sworn brothers with the son of Qing officer So Oksang. While wandering in this region, I heard that a man named Kim Ayon was organizing a righteous army to resist Japan with the help of the Qing. According to people, Kim Ayon was from Byeokdong, possessed great strength, and wrote well. Because he had received a horse and a set of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms as a prize from the governor of Shenyang, he was treated with respect even by Chinese military commanders. We decided to seek out this man. First, to secretly investigate whether he was truly a patriot or a swindler, I sent Kim Hyung-jin ahead and followed by another route, asking around. One day, on the road nearly 100 ri from the Yalu River, I met a young Qing military officer riding a horse branded with an official seal on its rump. On the Qing military hat he wore, a jade button shone and a red tassel fluttered. Without a thought, I grabbed the head of his horse. He dismounted. Because I didn't know Chinese, I carried a written statement explaining the purpose of my travel, which I showed to the officer. He took the writing, read it, and began to weep aloud before he even finished. Surprised, I asked him why he was crying. He pointed to a phrase in my writing, Tong Piwai Jeok Yoabo Gongde Cheon Jisu. The Japanese pirates are sworn enemies under the same sky with whom I cannot live, and grabbed me, weeping again. When I took out my brush case to communicate through writing, he picked up a brush first and asked me instead why the Japanese were my enemy. I wrote that not only have they been our enemies for generations since the Imjin War, but just last month, the Japanese had burned our Queen Mother to death. Then I asked him what on earth made him wail so upon reading my writing. Listening to his reply, he said he was the son of So Oksang, a commander who had died in battle in Pyongyang the previous year. He had asked the governor of Gangye to help find his father's body, and upon hearing it was found, he went there, only to discover it was not his father's corpse, so he was making a futile journey back home. I told him that I had seen a wooden tablet reading the site of So Okoksang's death in battle outside the Potong Gate in Pyongyang. He detailed that his home was in Jinzhou and his family had commanded 1,500 soldiers. His father, Oksang, had taken 1,000 of them to war and was wiped out, leaving 500 at home. He explained that they were wealthy, he was 30 years old, giving the age of his wife and the number of his sons and daughters. He then asked my age, and finding I was younger, said he would call me little brother, and I should call him older brother, proposing we become sworn brothers. Saying we shared the same enemy, he asked me to live with him and wait for our time, inviting me to go to Jinzhou with him. Before I could even answer, he took the load off my back, tied it to his horse, helped me onto the saddle, and walked behind on foot. I thought deeply as we traveled for a while. The opportunity was excellent. The reason I originally set out on this journey was to forge ties with Chinese figures, so establishing a connection with a prestigious family like Seo's was exactly what I had desired. However, the one thing weighing on my mind was that I had no way to inform Kim Hyung-jin. Had Kim Hyung-jin been with me, I would have followed Seo right then. Since I had been away from home for nearly a year, unaware of my parents' well-being and the situation in Seoul, I told him I would return to my homeland to visit my parents and assess the state of the nation before following my brother to Jinzhou, and firmly parted ways with him. Fifth, joining Kim Il-sun's righteous army and the defeat at the Battle of Ganggae Fortress. Posing as a comb seller and asking about Kim Il-sun's affairs from house to house, I reached Samdogu, Kim Il-sun's base, 5 or 6 days after parting with Seo. Kim Il-sun was in his 50s that year. He was so strong that in Shenyang he could repeatedly lift and drop a 500 gun, approx 300 kilograms cannon with both hands while sitting. He appeared to lack courage and seemed too overconfident in himself to have the broad-mindedness to accept others' opinions. Rather, his comrade, a man named Kim Gyu-hyun, who had served as an Ibang, local clerk in Choson, seemed to possess both righteousness and strategic mind. Kim Il-sun became the head of the righteous army and recruited hunters from Choson, Gangye, Wiwon, Byeokdong, and compatriots living across the river in Chinese territory who owned hunting guns, maintaining an armed force of about 300 men. The justification for raising the army was that the Queen Mother had been killed by Japanese pirates, a national disgrace that could not be tolerated. With this sentiment, Kim Gyu-hyun, a good writer, penned manifestos and scattered them in all directions. Kim Hyung-jin and I also decided to participate. I was tasked with moving secretly around Choson and Wiwon to recruit hunters and infiltrating Ganggae Fortress to buy gunpowder. The time for the uprising was set for early November of the Olmi year, when the Yalu River would freeze over. The plan was to march the troops over the ice and capture Ganggae Fortress. On my way back to our base in Samdogu after finishing my tasks in Wiwon, I was crossing the Yalu River when I stepped on thin ice. My entire body plunged into the river, leaving only my 2 arms on the ice. I had no way to spring up and could only scream at the top of my lungs for someone to save me. Villagers who heard my cries came out, pulled me from the hole in the ice, and took me to a house. By then, my clothes had already turned into a stiff block of ice. Finally, the day to attack Ganggae Fortress arrived. First, we attacked Gosanri, seized the weapons there, and distributed them to unarmed soldiers. This was the first misstep. I had argued that we should not attack Gosanri first, but instead launch a surprise attack directly on Ganggae Fortress. If the rumor that we had attacked Gosanri spread, the defense of Ganggae Fortress would become even stricter, so it would be more advantageous to catch Ganggae off guard than to acquire a few more weapons at Gosanri. Staff officers like Kim Gyu-hyun and Jin Sa-bak agreed with my opinion, but Kim Il-sun stubbornly refused to listen to the end. The soldiers who seized weapons in the Battle of Gosan marched to Ganggae the next day. In the middle of the night, as we drove the entire army over the frozen surface of the Dongnogang River, and the vanguard reached a place about 10 ri from the Inpungnu Pavilion, we saw flashes of matchlock fires in the pine forest south of the river. Since they were all matchlock guns back then, the soldiers were holding lit matches. Several officers of the Ganggae garrison emerged from the pine forest to seek out Kim Il-sun, and their first question was whether there were Qing soldiers among our incoming forces. To this, Kim Il-sun replied that Qing soldiers had not come this time, but they had agreed to come as soon as we sent word that we had captured Ganggae. While this might have been the honest truth, it was not a strategic answer. Initially, I had insisted that a few of us disguise ourselves as Qing officers and stand at the vanguard. However, Kim Ayon obstinately maintained that it was not right to feign the power of Qing soldiers in this battle to avenge our Queen Mother, and that the capture of Gange Fortress should be done honorably by us in our white clothes, adding that there was no need to worry, as the Gange garrison officers had already promised to respond from within. I argued that the so-called Gange garrison officers would be swayed by power rather than driven by patriotism, making it strategically crucial to disguise ourselves as Qing officers. However, Kim Il-eon refused to listen to the very end. Seeing the Gange garrison officers shaking their heads and turning back, I realized the tide had already turned against us. Sure enough, just about the time the officers returned to their positions, the matchlock fires moved all at once. Gunshots shook the air, and bullets rained down on us. The 1,000 or so men and horses on our side, who had been fully trusting and relaxed, were thrown into great chaos on the ice. They started running wildly in all directions. There were already people falling from gunshots, screaming that they were dying and crying all around. Realizing that everything had gone wrong and seeing that Kim Ayon would not be able to recover from this defeat, Kim Hyung-jin and I decided to quietly slip away and escape. So, we fled in the opposite direction of the fleeing soldiers, paradoxically moving closer to Gange Fortress, to a village right below the Inpungnu Pavilion, but there was no one in any of the houses. We went into the largest house among them. There was no answer when we called from outside, and no one inside. But in the empty house, a large sacrificial table was set with all sorts of food, and liquor bottles were under the table. First, we ate our fill of the liquor and food. Later, when the owner returned, he said that they had been holding a memorial service for his father when they were startled by the gunshots, causing the family and guests to all flee to the mountains. Sixth, return home, broken engagement, and anger over the short hair act. Leaving Gange the next day, we crossed over the Doeniomi Pass and returned to Incheon in a few days. On the way to Cheonggye-dong, I was greatly shocked to hear that Teacher Go's eldest son, Won Myung, and his wife had both died of cholera. Before even going to my own home, I first visited Teacher Go's house, but the teacher was unexpectedly calm and collected. I felt awkward and lost for words. When I was leaving home, Teacher Go had said something cryptic. "Let's have the wedding ceremony soon." Upon returning home and listening to my parents, I finally learned that while I was away, I had been engaged to Teacher Go's granddaughter, Won Myung's daughter. My parents took turns explaining the sequence of events leading to the engagement. My father's account was as follows. One day, Teacher Go visited our house, saw my father, and suggested that since he had no sons around and felt lonely, my father should come to his guest room for a chat. So one day, when my father went to Teacher Go's guest room, Teacher Go asked my father about my childhood. My father recounted how I had studied hard as a child, how I returned from Haeju in despair after taking the civil service exam, how I was disappointed upon reading a physiognomy book because my facial features were not good, how I joined the Donghak movement to cultivate my mind, hoping to become a person with a good heart since I lacked good physiognomy, and how I had declared that while the Kangs and Lees in the neighboring village were dead nobles selling their ancestors' bones, I would cultivate my mind and act righteously to become a living noble. My mother added stories about how, when we lived in Gangneung and I was young, I went to Sinpung Lee Sengwon's house with a knife, intending to stab and kill everyone in his family, only to have the knife taken away and return beaten. How I was severely beaten by my father for strapping 20 nyang of coins to my waist and trying to go buy rice cakes. And how my mother had spanked me soundly when she saw I had taken out all the blue dye and poured it into the stream. Then, one day, Teacher Go asked my father what he thought about a marriage between me and his eldest granddaughter. My father declined, saying, "Whether looking at lineage, virtue, or my son's appearance, how dare we disgrace the teacher's family?" To this, Teacher Go looked at my father and told him not to lament my ugly appearance, saying that Chang-soo had the face of a tiger, and in the future there would come a day when he would emit the scent of a tiger, roar like a tiger, and astonish the world. This is how my engagement came to be. Hearing my parents' words, I felt the heavy responsibility of Teacher Go promising me his beloved granddaughter out of such high expectations for someone like me. Furthermore, when I heard that the teacher had said, "Since my eldest son and his wife are both dead, I intend to rely on Chang-soo from now on. And also, I have met many young men since coming to Cheonggyeong, but there is no man like Chang-soo," I felt even more overwhelmed. Regarding the young lady, whether by her appearance, her heart, or the family education she had received, I was satisfied. It went without saying how happy my parents were about this engagement. Merely getting their only son married was a joyous occasion, and they seemed to consider it an even greater honor to marry into the family of a renowned scholar and nobleman. Therefore, despite our meager livelihood, both families were busy preparing for the wedding. Although the ceremony had not yet taken place, Teacher Go's family seemed to view me as a son-in-law. If I happened to have dinner at the teacher's house, the maiden would bring out the dining table, and her 7 or 8-year-old younger brother even called me uncle and was happy to see me. In fact, I even assisted in the funeral of Won Myung and his wife, my future father-in-law and mother-in-law. I reported to the teacher what I had seen on this journey. I detailed how the land across the Tumen and Yalu rivers was fertile and geographically forming a natural fortress, sufficient for transplanting our compatriots and training soldiers. How pure-hearted the people there were, and how I had become sworn brothers with the son of So Ok-sang. At that time, the faction of Kim Hong-jip, backed by Japan, had seized political power in our country and was rapidly reforming all systems by issuing decrees called Sinjong. One of the new laws was the Short Hair Act, Danbalyong. The king, whom we called the Great Monarch, was to cut his hair and wear Western suits first, and everyone from officials down to commoners was to be forced to cut theirs. Although this act was issued across the 8 provinces, the people refused to comply, so in large cities like Seoul and provincial capitals, soldiers guarded every street corner, grabbing passers-by and cutting off their top knots. Because this was called nuksak, or forced shaving, those who suffered it wailed as if a great tragedy had occurred. This Short Hair Act caused immense public resentment. Some scholars carried axes and submitted memorials to the throne stating, "I would rather have my head cut off than my hair cut." Writings declaring that one would rather become a headless ghost in the underworld than live as a man with cut hair spread from mouth to mouth like manifestos, inciting the public mind. The reason people so deeply hated and opposed the cutting of hair was not merely derived from the Confucian teaching. My body, hair, and skin are received from my parents. Not daring to damage them is the beginning of filial piety. It also stemmed from the animosity that this was being dictated by Japan. The military and police had already finished cutting their hair, and civil officials down to petty clerks were in the process of implementing it. I advised Teacher Go to consult with Jinsa-an and raise a righteous army. This would be a righteous army opposing the short hair mandate, and we equated opposition to short hair directly with the expulsion of the Japanese. A meeting was held, but Jinsa-an's thoughts differed from ours. His opinion was that starting something with no hope of winning would only lead to failure, so we should just believe in Catholicism and wait for the right time to rise up. He even went so far as to say that if he had to cut his hair, he was willing to do so. At Jinsa-an's words, Teacher Go said without hesitation, "Jinsa, from today, I cut ties with you," and kicked his seat and walked out. Cutting ties is an expression scholars in our country have used since ancient times to declare the severing of relations. Watching this scene, I too felt disappointed in Jinsa-an. For a person of Jinsa-an's character to practice the Catholicism of the Western barbarians while risking his life to suppress the Donghak movement that arose in his own country, whether it was right or wrong, was bizarre enough. But even so, for him to not only lack the resolve to have his head severed rather than his hair cut, but to even harbor thoughts of complying with the haircut, was, I thought, a violation of great righteousness. Disappointed with Jinsa-an's attitude, Teacher Go and I decided to quickly have my wedding and leave Cheonggyedo. I intended to go find the son of So in Jinzhou. However, unexpectedly, another unfortunate event occurred. Early one morning, Teacher Go came to see me with a greatly despondent face and said the following. Yesterday, while I was sitting in the guest room, a certain Mr. Kim came to look for me and asked, "Are you Go so-and-so?" When I said yes, the man approached me, pulled out a knife and said, "I heard you promised your granddaughter in marriage to Kim Chang-soo. Well, if you are giving her as a concubine, I don't know, but she cannot be the legal wife. Kim Chang-soo has already been engaged to my daughter for a long time." Therefore, I replied, "I gave my granddaughter's hand thinking Kim Chang-soo had no prior engagement. If he is already engaged, how could that be? I will meet with Kim Chang-soo and resolve this, so go back," and sent him away. But there's been a great uproar in my household. Hearing this, I realized things had taken a bad turn, so I spoke decisively to the teacher. "My reverence for you, teacher, is to receive your lofty teachings, not to become your grandson-in-law. What does it matter whether I marry or not? I will give up the marriage and serve you for the rest of my life purely out of the duty between a student and a teacher." Hearing my words, Teacher Go shed tears, lamenting that this strange disaster had occurred while trying to gain me as a grandson-in-law, and finally said, "If so, let us not bring up the matter of marriage again. However, since the officials have finished cutting their hair and they seem poised to enforce the hair cutting on the common people, go into hiding urgently to avoid the disaster of having your hair cut. If the forced haircut reaches me, I have decided to die." I had made up my mind and boasted that it was okay not to marry Teacher Go's granddaughter, but inwardly I was quite disappointed. I deeply loved the young lady and had grown attached to her. The person who obstructed this marriage was a man named Kim Chi-gyong, whose registered domicile was Jongpyeong, Hamgyong Province. More than 10 years ago, my father met him in a tavern, and while drinking together, heard that Kim had a daughter of about 8 or 9. In a drunken remark, my father said, "Let's marry her to my son," and they made a pledge. After that, my father kept the promise, sent my saju, the 4 pillars of destiny used for marriage, and sometimes brought the girl to our house to stay. However, I hated it when my schoolmates teased me, calling me the son-in-law of the wooden bowl seller. Also, once when I was spinning a top on the ice, the girl followed me and pestered me to make one for her too, which I found so annoying and hateful that I went home, threw a tantrum to my mother, and had the girl sent back to her home. But the engagement was not broken off. Many years passed, and when the Sino-Japanese War broke out in the Gabo year, a trend emerged where people rushed to get even their young children married off, saying sons and daughters must be married. One day, while I was running around as a Donghak parish leader, I returned from a trip to find that my family had prepared liquor and rice cakes, set up all the wedding gear, and was waiting for me to hold the ceremony with that girl. However, I stubbornly resisted, insisting I didn't want to. Eventually, Kim Chi-gyong found it better to formally break off the engagement, and Kim even betrothed his daughter to another man for money. Yet, hearing the rumor that I was marrying into the Go family, Kim had come to Teacher Go's house and made a huge fuss, hoping to extort some money. My father was furious and went to find Kim Chi-gyong, having a big fight with him, but it was already spilt milk that could not be gathered again. Thus, my marriage issue came to an unfortunate end, and Teacher Go, having no intention of staying in Cheonggyedong any longer, returned to his hometown of Bidong in Haeju. I also left Cheonggyedong to head to the Seo family's house in Jinzhou. Thus, my path of wandering continued once more. Upon arriving at the Pyongyang Provincial Office, I found that all officials, from the governor downwards, had already cut their hair, and now they were blocking the streets, randomly grabbing passers-by and cutting off their top knots. People were stealthily slipping out of Pyongyang and fleeing to villages and mountain towns to avoid getting their hair cut, and the voices of the people's resentment filled the streets. Seeing this, anger surged to the top of my head. I clenched my fists tightly, thinking that by any means necessary I must overthrow this wicked government playing into the hands of the Japanese. When I arrived at the Anju garrison, an order suspending the haircutting was posted on the bulletin board. Disliking the reformist faction, the king had fled to the Russian legation, and the conservative faction, backed by Russian power, had beaten the Prime Minister Kim Hong-jip to death and rolled back the wheels of reform. From this point on, a power struggle between Russia and Japan began in our country, and the conflict between the pro-Russian and pro-Japanese factions unfolded. 7th, the Chihapo incident in Anak, execution of Japanese Lieutenant Tsuchida Josuke. My state of mind completely changed due to the political upheaval in Hanseong, Seoul. What need was there to force myself to go to a foreign country? Since it was said that righteous armies were rising up in various places in the Samnam, southern region, I decided to stay in the homeland, observe the state of affairs, and then determine my next move. I turned my path back, passed through Yonggang, and decided to go to Anak. I boarded a ferry at Chihapo. It was late February of the Byeongsan year, 1896, and countless mountains of ice were drifting down this waterway, the lower reaches of the Taedong River. Our ferry, carrying 15 or 16 men and women, was trapped by mountains of ice, losing its freedom of movement. It was swept down below Jinampo and then began drifting up and down the river with the tide. Not to mention the passengers, even the boatmen cried and wailed, thinking they were dead. Every year at this time and in this passage, such tragedies frequently occurred, and now we were the ones facing it. There was no food on the boat, so even if we avoided a shipwreck, the people would either freeze or starve to death. Fortunately, there was one donkey on board. If things continued like this for several days, we decided we would have to cruelly slaughter and eat it. Thinking that merely crying would be useless, I suggested to the passengers that we join forces with the boatmen and try to push the ice mountains away together. I hurled my body and boldly leaped onto the ice mountain to assess the situation. Then, leaning against a large ice mountain, I pushed a smaller one, repeating this method to barely find a path of survival. Thus, we landed on the riverbank about 5 ri from Chihapo, while the setting moon over the western mountains across the river still cast a glow. Walking through the night in the cold wind, we entered the house of the Chihapo ferry owner. Guests who had been stranded due to the blocked waterways caused by the storm filled the 3-room house, snoring loudly. Our group squeezed in among them, and just as we were about to fall asleep, the people who had arrived earlier got up and started clamoring for the boat to be launched on the early morning tide since the weather was good today. Soon, dining tables began to be brought in, starting from the lower room. I also had no choice but to sit up, and while waiting for my table to arrive, I looked around the room. A man with short hair in the middle room caught my eye. Listening to him greet a fellow traveler, I heard his surname was Jong, and he lived in Jangyeon. The Short Hair Act had been implemented early in Jangyeon, so many civilians there also had their hair cut. However, his accent was not the Jangyeon dialect, but the Seoul dialect. Although his Korean was quite fluent, to my eyes, he was clearly a Japanese bastard. Looking closely, I could see the scabbard of a military sword under his white durumaji, traditional overcoat. When asked where he was going, he said he was heading to Jinampo. An ordinary Japanese merchant or artisan would have no reason to disguise his attire and change his name like this. I reasoned he must certainly be either Miura Goro, the bastard who killed the Queen Mother, or one of his gang, or even if he were neither, it was clear he was a poisonous fungus to our nation and people. I resolved that by killing at least this one bastard, I would wash away a piece of our shame. Then I weighed my strength against the environment. I couldn't tell how many more of his gang were among the 40-odd guests in the 3 rooms, but one young boy, who looked about 17 or 18, was attending to him by his side. I pondered. There are 2 of those bastards, and they have a sword. I am alone and barehanded. Moreover, if I lay a hand on him, the people in the room will surely rush in to stop me, and taking advantage of the moment when people are holding me back, his sword will inevitably fall on my neck. As I hesitated, my heart pounded, and my mind and body were in such turmoil that I could not calm myself, suffering deep anguish. At that moment, a teaching from Teacher Go suddenly came to mind. Doksubanji bujoki hyonechel sujangbua. Holding onto a branch to save oneself is not enough to be considered remarkable. Letting go of one's grip on the cliff's edge makes one a true man. I realized a ray of light illuminating my heart. Then I asked and answered myself, is it right to kill that Japanese bastard? It is right. Have you desired to become a person with a good heart since childhood? I have. If you see righteousness, you must do it. Is it not the deed of those who cherish their bodies and names to weigh the success or failure of an act and hesitate? That is so. I am a person who acts for righteousness, not one who acts for my body or name. After this internal dialogue, the wind died down and the waves became still in the ocean of my heart, and all sorts of strategies naturally surfaced. I decided to tightly bind the 40 guests and hundreds of villagers with an invisible rope so they could not move their limbs, make that Japanese bastard feel completely at ease without a speck of suspicion, and adopt a method where I alone could act freely. While the other guests were receiving their early morning breakfast tables, I, who received my table later, finished a bowl of rice in 4 or 5 mouthfuls before they had eaten even a third. I stood up, called the owner, and told him that since I had to walk 700 rai before sunset today, he should bring 7 more tables of food. The owner, a man of handsome build who looked about 37 or 8, did not answer me but looked around at the other guests in the room and said, I pity the young man. He must be a madman, and went inside. I lay down on one side, resting my head on a wooden pillow, watching the movements of the crowd in the room and that Japanese bastard. A seemingly educated young man agreed with the owner's words, calling me a madman, but an old man smoking a pipe rebuked the young man, saying, Look here, watch your words. Is there a rule that extraordinary people don't exist nowadays? In times like these, strange people are bound to appear, and covertly glanced at me. The young man followed the old man's gaze, glanced at me, pouted, and said in a mocking tone loud enough for me to hear, It's not that there couldn't be extraordinary people, but look at the state of that guy. How could such a person be extraordinary? However, the Japanese bastard finished his meal without showing any sign of paying attention to me. He went outside, leaned against the doorframe, and watched the young boy pay for the meal while looking into the room. Thinking the time had come, I rose slowly, shouted, You bastard! And kicked the Japanese bastard in the chest with my foot. He tumbled down below the stone steps, which were nearly an arm's span high. I dashed down like flying and stepped on his neck. The 4 doors of the 3-room house slid open all at once, and people's heads poked out. Facing the crowd pouring out, I declared, Know that anyone who dares to interfere with me for the sake of this Japanese bastard will all be killed. Before these words were even finished, the Japanese bastard, who had been kicked and pinned under my foot, twisted his body, drew his sword, and lunged at me with a flash. Dodging the blade falling toward my face, I lifted my foot, kicked his flank to knock him over, and stepped on the wrist holding the sword with all my might. The sword naturally fell onto the frozen ground with a clatter. I picked up the sword and hacked the Japanese bastard to pieces from head to toe. On the icy ground, in the cold dawn of February, blood gushed out like a spring. I scooped up the blood with my hands and drank it, smeared the Japanese blood on my face, and holding the long sword dripping with blood, I entered the room and roared, asking who the bastard was that tried to attack me earlier for the Japanese. The travelers who hadn't managed to flee all prostrated themselves flat on the floor. One said, General, please spare my life. I didn't know he was a Japanese. I thought he was an ordinary person and went out to stop it. Another said, I am the person who suffered on the sea with you yesterday, General. I am not someone who came with the Japanese. Among the people trembling with fear, only the old man who had rebuked the young man for mocking me as a madman earlier stuck out his chest, looked straight at me, and said, General, they are still young and senseless. Please forgive them. At this time, the owner, Lee Sondal Wabo, didn't even dare enter the room. He knelt outside the door and bowed his head to the ground, saying, This lowly one has only eyes but no pupils, so I failed to recognize who you were and despised you, General. Even if I die, I have no regrets. However, I have no relationship with that Japanese bastard. My only crime is selling him rice. Please just kill me for the crime of insulting you earlier. I asked the owner who the Japanese was, and according to what I learned, The Japanese had hitched a ride on a Korean boat from Hwangju and was on his way to Chihapo. I ordered the owner to call the boatman of that boat and quickly bring the Japanese man's belongings from the boat. Soon, the boatman brought the Japanese man's things and begged for their lives, saying their only crime was taking the fare and carrying him. Investigating the belongings, the Japanese was an army lieutenant named Tsuchida Josuke, and there were 600 nyang of brass coins in his luggage. I distributed the boatman's fare from that money and ordered the rest to be used to relieve the poor people of this village. The owner, Lee Sondal, was also the village head. Regarding the disposal of the corpse, I commanded as follows. Since the Japanese bastard is not only an enemy of our country and people, but also an enemy to the fish in the water, throw his corpse into the river so the fish can eat the flesh of the nation's enemy. The owner, Lee Sondal, very swiftly brought water to wash my face on one side, and on the other, placed 7 bowls of rice on one table and noodles and side dishes on another. I washed my face, cleaned the blood off my face and hands, pulled the dining table closer, and began to eat. Although it had only been 10 minutes since I finished 1 bowl of rice, due to the extreme physical exertion, I felt I could eat 1 or 2 more bowls, but I couldn't possibly eat all 7. However, feeling ashamed to turn what I said earlier into a lie, I asked for a large brass bowl, poured the rice and side dishes together, mixed them, asked for another spoon, layered the 2 spoons, scooped up a mouthful as big as a rice bowl, and after eating about 2 bowls worth in large, appetizing bites, threw down the spoon and muttered to myself, feigning innocence. Having drank a lot of the Japanese blood I wanted to drink today, the rice won't go down. After the meal, having settled the disposal of Tsuchida Josuke's corpse and his money, I called the owner Lee Hwabo, ordered him to prepare paper and a brush, wrote a manifesto stating I killed this Japanese to avenge the Queen Mother, signed it as Kim Chang-soo, Donghak follower from Baekbeomilji, Haeju at the end, and had it posted on a wall along the main road. I ordered Lee Hwabo, the village head, to report this fact to the Anak County magistrate, and then leisurely left the place. 8th. Arrest and torture at the Haeju Provincial Office. When I arrived at Incheon town, it happened to be a market day. So many market-goers had gathered. Here and there, I could hear them talking about Chihapo. They were saying things like, a strong man had appeared and beaten a Japanese to death with 1 punch, that when the ferry was caught in the ice mountains, the strong man jumped into the river and pushed the ice away with his hands to save the people on board, and that he ate 7 bowls of rice in the blink of an eye. Returning home, I reported everything that had happened to my parents in detail. My parents told me to flee somewhere, but since I had done a just and honorable deed for the country, I not only did not want to flee cowardly, but I also felt it would be glorious even if I were caught and beheaded, as it would serve as a lesson to the people. Thus, I waited at home for them to come and arrest me. More than 3 months passed. Early in the morning on the 11th day of May of the Byongsin year, 1896, before I had even gotten out of bed, my mother opened the twig gate and said, "Son, people we haven't seen before in this neighborhood are surrounding our house." As soon as she finished speaking, dozens of men wielding iron whips and maces rushed in, shouting, "Are you Kim Chang-soo?" I said, "Yes, I am Kim Chang-soo, but who are you people to enter someone else's house so violently?" Only then did one of them show an arrest warrant, marked, by order of the Ministry of Interior, and tied me up, pushing me forward. There were over 30 policemen and runners in total. My body was bound tightly with multiple layers of iron chains. 1 person in front and 1 in back held the ends of the iron chains binding me, while the rest surrounded me on all sides, hurrying along the road toward Haeju. The 20 or so households in the village were all my relatives, but they were all so frightened that not a single person dared open their door to look out. I could see the people of the Kang and Lee families in the neighboring village whispering that Kim Chang-soo was being dragged away like that for his crime of participating in the Donghak movement. After 2 days, I found myself imprisoned in the Haeju jail. My mother begged for food to support me in prison, while my father visited the Yeongnicheong and Saryongcheong and runners' offices to campaign for my release using his old acquaintances, but because the incident was so severe, it had no effect at all. More than a month after being imprisoned, I was dragged into the courtyard of Songwadang, the provincial governor's office, wearing a large wooden kangu around my neck, and underwent my first interrogation by Governor Min Yong-chol. Min Yong-chol asked, "I heard you murdered a Japanese person and committed robbery in Chihapo." To this I flatly denied, saying there was no such thing. The governor raised his voice. "You scoundrel, the evidence of your deeds is crystal clear, yet you still say you don't know? Listen here, handle that scoundrel harshly." Amand. The runners rushed in, bound my ankles and knees tightly, shoved 2 red-painted cudgels between my legs, and one man grabbed each cudgel and pressed down with all his might, twisting my legs, a torture called jury. Instantly, the flesh on my shins burst open, and the white bones were exposed. The large scar I still have on my left shin bone is from the wound I sustained then. I kept my mouth shut and refused to answer until I finally fainted. At this, they stopped the leg twisting and sprayed cold water on my face to revive me. Then the governor asked the same question again. I gathered my voice and said, "Having seen Governor Min's arrest warrant stating, 'By order of the Ministry of Interior, this is not a case for the provincial office to handle, so please report it to the Ministry of Interior.'" I had decided not to reveal the motive for killing the Japanese person until I went to Seoul. Hearing my words, Governor Min said nothing and had me taken down and locked up again. 9th. Transfer to Incheon Prison and a mother's devotion. 2 months later, in early July, I was transferred to Incheon. 4 or 5 policemen from the Incheon Superintendent's office came to Haeju to take me away. With things turning out this way, my return home became utterly uncertain. My father sold the house and all our household goods, deciding to follow wherever I was dragged, be it Seoul or Incheon, to manage affairs from behind. So he temporarily returned home, and only my mother followed me. On the first day after leaving Haeju, we slept overnight in Yonnan town. The next day, on the way to Najinpo, we took a break by a tomb by the roadside, about 5 rai from the town. The weather was extremely hot that day, so even the policemen bought and ate melons while resting their legs. A tombstone stood in front of the tomb where we were resting. The front read, "Tomb of the filial son Lee Chang-mei," and the back inscribed his life story. According to the epitaph, Lee Chang-mei was originally an attendant in the Yonnan magistracy. When his mother died, he tended to his mother's grave without fail, regardless of cold, heat, rain, or wind, for which the state bestowed a red gate of filial piety upon him. Also, in front of his father's tomb next to Lee Chang-mei's grave, it was said that grass could never grow on the footprints where he took off his shoes and walked to the altar, the spot where he knelt, and the place where he placed the incense burner and incense box. Even if people tried to fill in those hollowed spots, thunder would immediately roar, and a heavy rain would pour down to wash the soil away. Hearing the locals and policemen talk about this and seeing the story carved on the stone monument with my own eyes, I shed tears mixed with blood, trying to hide them from the policemen and my mother. That Lee Chang-mei was so deeply filial even to his deceased parents. How much more must he have been while they were alive? But look at my mother, rushing after me, almost having lost her mind. What an unfilial son I am. Being dragged away in iron chains, I kept looking back at the tomb of this filial son again and again, bowing in my heart countless times. It was the 25th day of July of the Byongsin year, 1896, a pitch-black night without moonlight, when I boarded the boat from Najinpo to Incheon. Even the waves were invisible, there was only the sound. About the time the boat passed Ganghwa Island, seeing that the policemen escorting me were exhausted from the summer heat travel and had fallen fast asleep, my mother spoke to me in a voice so low that not even the boatman could hear. "Son, since you will surely die at the hands of the Japanese if you go now, let us rather die together in this clear water, so that even as ghosts, mother and son can travel together." Saying this, she pulled my hand and moved closer to the edge of the boat. I was terrified and didn't know what to do, but I replied like this: "Do you think I am going there to die this time? I will absolutely not die. because what I did was a righteous act for the country with a sincerity that touches the heavens. Heaven will help me. I am definitely not going to die. My mother still pulled my hand, urging us to drown in the sea, so I comforted her with even more confidence. Mother, I am definitely not going to die. Only then did my mother abandon her resolve to die. She said, I promised your father, the day you die, our couple will die together. And then, rubbing her hands together and looking up at the sky, she offered a prayer in a low, unintelligible voice. Heaven and earth remained pitch black, and only the sound of the unseen waves could be heard. I entered the Incheon Prison. The reason I was transferred to the Incheon Prison was that, following the Gabo reforms, a special court was established in Incheon to hear cases involving foreigners. The prison I was held in was located in Nairi. The superintendent's office was on the ridge, its left wing being the police headquarters and its right wing the patrol office. The prison was in front of the patrol office, and in front of that stood a two-story gatehouse leading to all these government offices. The low building inside the high surrounding wall was the prison, which was divided in half. One side held convicts serving hard labor and unconvicted prisoners charged with major crimes like robbery, theft, and murder, while the other side housed petty criminals. Unconvicted prisoners wore plain clothes, but convicts serving hard labor wore blue uniforms, and their crimes, such as robbery, murder, or theft, were written in ink on the backs of their jackets. When these prisoners were dragged out of the prison to work, their left and right shoulders were bound together with iron chains, tying them in pairs with a single chain, with the knot of the chain on the prisoner's back secured with a padlock. I could see guards driving prisoners around like this. When I was first imprisoned in Incheon, I was treated as a thief and had my ankles locked in a long wooden stock that held 9 people together, right in the middle of 8 other thieves. Lihuabo, the owner from Chihapo, who had been brought here a month earlier, was glad to see me enter the prison. He told me that the Japanese had torn down and hidden the statement I wrote explaining my reasons for killing Tsuchida Josuke and posted on the wall of his house, and had completely framed me as a robber. I briefly turned my head and saw my mother standing outside the prison gate, shedding tears. Although my mother grew up in a rural village, she was resolute in everything she did, and being especially skilled in sewing, she went to the house of Park Yong-moon, a man from Gaesong living outside the 3 gates of the superintendent's office. She explained her circumstances and entered his house as a kitchen maid, trying to save this son's life. This house was a famous guest house in the port of Incheon, and because its household was large, there was a lot of work for kitchen maids and seamstresses. In exchange for doing this work, my mother arranged for me to be brought 3 meals a day. One day, the prison guard called me out and told me to be at ease, as my mother had found a place to rely on and 3 meals a day would be coming in. The other prisoners envied me very much. I could not help but think again of the ancient saying, "Ee bumo sangaguro yokbo gion hochon mangok." Alas, my parents suffered greatly to bear and raise me. I wish to repay their kindness, but I grieve that it is as high as the heavens and has no end. My mother endured thousands and 10,000s of hardships to feed and keep me alive. The saying in Buddhist scriptures that the relationship between parent and child is a bond of grace and love spanning thousands of lifetimes is truly not empty words. The inside of the prison was unutterably filthy, and since it was still summer, it was truly unbearable. On top of that, I contracted typhoid fever, and my suffering reached its peak. At one point, contemplating suicide, I used the time when the other prisoners were asleep to carve the character Chung, loyalty, on my forehead with my fingernails and hung myself by the neck with my belt until I stopped breathing. It happened while my breathing had stopped. In an instant, I went to my hometown and played with my second cousin Chang Hak, whom I usually cherished. Go won Jungjae Mok, Honjo Bulsucho. Spending long years longing for my hometown before my eyes, my soul has already gone there even without being called. This was indeed no empty saying. Suddenly, I regained my senses and found the prisoners next to me screaming and making a huge fuss that they were dying. They were not doing this out of worry that I had died. Apparently, I had thrashed about violently while unconscious, shaking the stocks and hurting their ankles. After that, people kept watch, so I was not given the chance to commit suicide, and I myself resolved that even if I were to die from illness or be killed by enemies, I would not take my own life with my own hands. 10th, interrogation at the Incheon Superintendent's office and spirit. During that time, I recovered from the illness, but having not touched food for half a month, my energy was completely depleted and I could not support my body. At that time, word came that I was to be interrogated. I thought to myself, the reason I kept my mouth shut and didn't speak despite enduring the cruel torture of having my leg bones exposed in Haeju was to speak out grandly before the high officials at the Ministry of Interior. However, unfortunately, due to illness, I do not know when I might die, so I must inevitably declare my purpose for killing the Japanese right here. I was carried on the back of a prison guard into the police headquarters. As I entered, I saw the instruments of torture used to interrogate thieves laid out strictly. Seeing my appearance after the guard set me down, Police Chief Kim Gojong asked why I looked like that, and the guard reported that it was due to suffering from a fever. Kim Gojong asked me, "Are you lucid enough to adequately answer the questions asked?" To which I replied, "I am lucid, but my throat is so parched that words do not come out easily. If you give me a cup of water to drink, I will speak." Thereupon, the police chief ordered liquor to be brought and fed me liquor instead of water. Police Chief Kim sat on the main floor and sequentially asked my name, address, and age. Then he asked if I had murdered a Japanese person at Chihapo in Anak on a certain month and day. I answered clearly, "I did." "Why did you kill that Japanese person?" "I heard you killed him to rob his wealth," the police chief asked. Thinking now is the time, even without much strength, I cleared my voice and said, "I did beat a Japanese pirate to death to avenge Her Majesty the Queen, but there is no truth to the claim that I robbed him of his wealth." At this, the police chief and the officials sitting in a row on the floor just stared blankly at each other, and the hall fell silent. Sitting on a chair to the side, acting as an observer or a monitor, was a Japanese police officer, whom I later heard was named Watanabe. Seeing the suspicious atmosphere in the hall at the very beginning of the interrogation, he seemed to be asking the interpreter what was going on. Gathering all my remaining strength, I roared out, "You bastard!" Then I continued, "In what article of the so-called Universal International Law does it say you can sign a treaty of commerce and amity and then murder that country's king or queen? You dog-like Japanese bastards! How dare you murder Her Majesty our Queen? In life, with this body, and in death, as a ghost, I swear I will kill your king and eradicate you Japanese bastards without leaving a single seed to wash away the disgrace of our nation." When I raised my voice and scolded him, the police officer Watanabe must have been terrified, as he muttered, "Chikusho, Chikusho," and disappeared behind the main hall. I later learned that Chikusho means beast, and is a Japanese curse word. The atmosphere in the hall grew even more tense. An official who was sitting alongside, whether a chief patrolman or a clerk was unclear, advised Police Chief Kim Gojong that since this incident was extremely grave, it would be proper to report to His Excellency the Superintendent to interrogate me in person. Police Chief Kim nodded and agreed with the opinion. Soon, Superintendent Lee Jae-jeong entered and sat in the higher seat from which the police chief had stepped down, and the police chief reported the progress of the interrogation to Superintendent Lee. The officials in the hall brought me water to drink without being ordered by their superiors. Before Superintendent Lee began to interrogate me, I opened my mouth and spoke to him first. "I, Kim Chang-soo, am but a lowly commoner from the countryside. Yet upon suffering the national disgrace of Her Majesty the Queen dying at the hands of Japanese enemies, I felt ashamed of my own shadow under the clear blue sky, so I killed at least one Japanese pirate. But I have not yet heard that anyone among our people has avenged Her Majesty the Queen by killing the Japanese king. Now I see that you officials have worn white mourning clothes for the national mourning. Have you forgotten the passage in the spring and autumn annals stating that one cannot wear mourning clothes if the enemy of the sovereign has not been avenged? And do you serve the king merely with the dirty intention of stealing your official positions and salaries? Looking at the expressions of Superintendent Lee Jae-jong, Police Chief Kim Yoon-jong, and other officials in the hall as they listened to my words, their faces all turned red and their heads dropped. I thought it was because their consciences were pricked. Superintendent Lee, who had remained silent for a long time even after I finished speaking, said in a voice that sounded as if he were pleading with me, "Listening to what Chang-soo is saying now, while I admire your loyalty, righteousness, and bravery, I feel incomparably humbled and ashamed. However, I must interrogate you and report according to the orders from above, so please testify to the facts in detail." He even used honorifics in his speech. At this time, Kim Yoon-jong whispered something to Superintendent Lee, implying that my illness was in a critical state, and then ordered the prison guard to take me back to the prison. As I was being carried out on the guard's back, I spotted my mother's face in the large crowd. Seeing a look of joy on her face, I figured she must have heard what I did at the government office from the crowd or officials and felt somewhat relieved. According to what my mother told me later, upon hearing that I was to be interrogated that day, she came and waited outside the prison gate. Seeing me being carried out, she worried immensely, thinking, what if he answered senselessly in his delirium from illness and was beaten to death on the spot? However, hearing people say that I had reprimanded the superintendent and he couldn't answer back, that I had shouted at and chased away a Japanese policeman, and that Kim Chang-soo was a young man from Haeju who beat a Japanese bastard to death to avenge Queen Min, she felt relieved. I remember the prison guard carrying me past my mother and saying, "Madam, do not worry at all. How on earth did you raise such a tiger-like son?" As soon as I returned to my cell, I caused a big commotion. Regarding them putting my ankles back in the stocks alongside other thieves like before, I became greatly enraged and shouted with a thunderous voice, "Until I announced my intentions, I kept quiet whether you treated me as a robber or whatever. But even today, after I have said all I had to say, you mistreat me like this? Even if you drew a line on the ground and called it a prison, I am not one to cross that line. If I had any intention of fleeing in the first place, would I have posted a manifesto with my address and name at the place where I killed that Japanese bastard and waited at home for 3 months for you to come arrest me? Are you officials treating me so poorly just to please the Japanese?" As I thrashed my body about, all 8 prisoners who had their ankles in the same stock exaggeratedly claimed that because I lifted the stock with one leg and stood up, all their ankles were broken. Hearing this commotion, Police Chief Kim Yoon-jong came in and scolded the prison guards on one hand and commanded them on the other, saying, "This person is different from other prisoners, so why do you put him with thieves? Immediately move this man to a good room, do not restrict his body in any way, and protect him well." From then on, I became a king in the prison. Not long after, my mother came to visit. My mother said that after I was interrogated and came out earlier, Police Chief Kim sent 150 nyang and told her to buy restorative medicine for me to take. She also said that not only the host couple of the house where she stayed, but even the guests in the sarangbang reception room respected me very much, saying, "If your son in prison wishes to eat anything, just say the word and we will make it for him." The fact that I lifted the large stock containing the ankles of 9 people with 1 foot pleased Liuabo immensely. The main reason he was suffering after being arrested was the accusation that he had let a murderer go. His defense, asking how he could tie up a strong man who ate 7 bowls of rice and walked 700 ri, was proven that day. 11th, education inside the prison, role as a scribe, and acceptance of new learning. From the next day, people seeking visits with me began to pour in. Hundreds of officials from the superintendent's office, police headquarters, patrol office, and runner's office had spread the word about me. It was said that among the influential people in the port of Incheon, as well as the laborers, many asked the officials they knew to let them know in advance the date of my next interrogation. On the day of my second interrogation, I was carried out on the back of the prison guard, just like the previous time. As I stepped outside the prison gate and looked around, the streets were packed with people. The police headquarters seemed to be filled with officials from various offices and influential figures from the port. People were climbed up thickly on walls, roofs, and anywhere they could see the courtyard of the police headquarters where I was to be interrogated. As I entered the hall and sat down, Kim Gojong quietly passed by me and said, "The Japanese are here again today, so scold them with all your might." Although Kim Gojong later held a Japanese official position as a counselor of Gyeonggi province, at that time I thought he was a man of righteous spirit. Surely, he couldn't have thought of the government office as a theater, making me an actor for a spectacle. Therefore, it is right to view it as the behavior of men lacking firm principles. A righteous spirit truly arose at the time, but changed as the days went by. In the second interrogation, I ended it with one word, saying I had said everything I had to say the previous time and had nothing more to add. Then, turning toward Watanabe, who was sitting in the back room peering at me, I poured out words reprimanding Japan again. From the next day, even more people came to visit me. They mostly said they came admiring my righteous spirit, introduced themselves as so-and-so living in such and such place, and said we should meet when I get out of prison. They reassured me, asking how my suffering could last long, and told me to rest easy. Almost everyone who came to visit brought a well-prepared table of food and offered it to me to eat. I would eat a bite or two with chopsticks in front of the person who brought it, and then hand out the rest sequentially to the prisoners. The prison system at that time was different from now. The prison did not provide 3 meals a day. Instead, prisoners were expected to weave straw shoes, sell them on the street, buy rice, and boil porridge to eat. Therefore, getting a share of the good food brought to me was their greatest joy. The third interrogation was not at the police headquarters, but at the superintendent's office, conducted by Superintendent Lee Jae-jung himself, and it seemed many figures from Incheon had gathered. In today's terms, it was an open trial. The superintendent questioned me very kindly, and after finishing, he showed me the interrogation record, let me read it, and told me to correct anything that needed changing. After the revisions were completed, I signed my name under the word Baek, confession. There were no Japanese present that day. A few days later, I was carried into the police headquarters again, because they said the Japanese were going to take my photograph. A large crowd had gathered that day as well. Kim Gojong said, loud enough for me to hear, "Those people have come to take Chang-soo's picture today, so clench your fists tightly, glare with your eyes wide open, and get your picture taken." However, a dispute arose between our officials and the Japanese over whether the photo could be taken or not, leading to a prolonged argument. Eventually, they decided they could not permit taking the photograph inside the government building, so they told them to take it on the street and sat me down on the road. When the Japanese demanded that I be handcuffed or bound with ropes to look like a criminal, Kim Gojong flatly refused, saying, "Since this man is a criminal whose sentence has not yet been decided, we cannot put instruments of torture on his body until there is an order from His Majesty the Great Monarch." The Japanese then said, "Isn't the criminal law itself the order of His Majesty the Great Monarch? Therefore, isn't it right to handcuff and bind Kim Chang-soo?" And stubbornly insisted on photographing me tied up. At this, Kim Gojong brushed them off, saying, "Since the Gabo reforms, instruments of torture have been abolished in our country." The Japanese bastard pushed back strictly, saying, "When I look at the prisoners in your country's prisons, they are all walking around in iron chains." Hearing this, Police Chief Kim flew into a rage and loudly scolded them. "Taking photographs of prisoners is not an obligation stipulated in the treaty. We cannot accept interference in our internal affairs over trivial matters that are mere reference materials." The spectators surrounding us were praising the police chief as an excellent official. Thus, I was to be photographed sitting on the street as a free man. But the Japanese begged the police chief again and barely managed to get permission to take the photograph with a rope placed next to me. Having recovered my strength compared to a few days ago, I gave a speech to the gathered crowd. "Everyone, the Japanese bastards killed our Queen Min. What greater shame and grudge is there for our people?" Do you think the poison of the Japanese will stop only within the palace? Eventually, your own sons and daughters will all die at the hands of the Japanese bastards. So, everyone, follow my example and beat every Japanese bastard you meet to death. Only by killing the Japanese can we live, I shouted. Watanabe came near me and spoke directly to me. If you are so loyal and righteous, why couldn't you get an official post? I only beat to death a petty Japanese bastard because I am a commoner who cannot hold office, but the nobles holding office will avenge us by cutting off your emperor's head, I answered Watanabe. That day I asked Kim Gojong to release Li Huabo, and Li Ho Abo was released that very day and returned home happy. From this point on, all my interrogations were finished, and I became a man of leisure, merely waiting for a verdict. What I did during this time was reading, teaching the prisoners how to read and write, and acting as a scribe, writing petitions on their behalf. I read and reread the great learning dakshui that my father had brought in for me. The text was good, and there were no other books anyway. However, thanks to a young official working at the superintendent's office, I unexpectedly read new books here and came into contact with a new culture that I hadn't even dreamed of in my 20 years of life. That official came to visit me and told me many new things. He spoke of the civilized countries of Europe and America, that our country could never save itself by just clinging to old ideologies and old knowledge while only rejecting the West and Japan, and that we must broadly study the politics, culture, economy, and science of the world, adopt what is good, and cultivate our own strength. He awakened me, saying, "A righteous man like Chang-soo should acquire new knowledge to renew the nation and its people. This is the enterprise of a hero. Holding only on to xenophobic ideologies cannot prevent the ruin of the nation." He not only enlightened me, but also brought me books published in China, written in classical Chinese, such as Taiseo Sinsa, New History of the West, and Segyeijiji, Geography of the World, as well as Korean books translated into mixed Korean-Chinese script. Knowing I was someone who could receive and have a death sentence executed at any moment, I avidly read these new books, not letting them out of my hands, with the thought that if I heard the right path in the morning, I could die content in the evening. Seeing me reading so earnestly, the official from the superintendent's office was also very pleased. While reading these books, I learned what the West was and what the situation of the world was like today, and at the same time, I began to critique myself and my country. I realized that it was not right for our people that Teacher Go used the era name of the Ming Dynasty in his invocations for ancestral rights. I also came to view his cutting ties with Jinsa An for studying Western learning, not as Teacher Go's broad-mindedness. When I was in Cheonggyeong, I accepted Teacher Go's theories as they were, knowing that rejecting the West and Japan was my sole vocation. I believed that the only place where the righteous way remained alive was our country alone, and that those who cut their hair and wore Western clothes were all barbarians akin to beasts. However, reading just one volume of the Taiseo Sinsa, I realized that those people with sunken eyes and prominent noses were not barbarians closely related to monkeys, but rather had established nations, governed the people with good laws, and possessed beautiful customs. I thought it was rather our corrupt officials, looking like immortals with their large hats and wide belts, who deserved the title of barbarians. I thereupon realized that what our country needed most was for everyone to learn and everyone to teach. Looking at the prisoners in the jail, none of them knew how to read, and their thoughts and speech were incredibly ignorant. I concluded that if the people were left like this, we could never wash away the nation's shame, nor could we gain the strength and wealth to compete with other nations. Therefore, I decided to put what I realized into practice and try to teach at least the prisoners who were with me in jail until the end of my days. There were an average of about 100 prisoners, counting those coming and going, and 9 out of 10 were completely illiterate. When I offered to teach them how to read, they did not refuse and pretended to learn, but with the exception of a few, it seemed their goal was rather to catch my eye and get to eat delicious food than having any interest in learning. For those who lived their lives through theft or murder, the thought of learning to read to become a better person didn't seem to arise at all. A man named Jo Deok-gun was supposed to study the great learning. He loudly read a phrase from the preface, Inseng pal semyon modu sohake dore oganda. When human life reaches 8 years, all enter elementary learning. However, he pronounced it as Ge Agardi Sohak, dog's mouth elementary learning, making me laugh until my sides split. This man was a gigolo for a jisang in Hwagadong, and he was serving a 10-year sentence for the crime of selling a woman to China. The time was around the second year of Jeonnam, 1897, and the Hwangsong Sinmun had been newly published. Someone brought me a newspaper one day, and after summarizing the details of my case, it was written that because Kim Chang-soo was teaching the prisoners in Incheon Prison, the prison had become a school. While acting as a teacher to the prisoners, I also ended up opening a scribe's office, writing appeals on their behalf for their wrongful grievances. Some people were actually released after I wrote petitions for them based on their stories of being wrongfully arrested, so my scribe work became famous. Furthermore, it was very difficult and costly for someone locked in prison to ask a person outside to write a petition. However, sitting face to face in the same cell, fully expressing what they wanted to say, and writing the petition cost absolutely nothing except the price of buying paper. People spread rumors that if I wrote a petition, they would definitely win the lawsuit. Some officials even asked me to draft petitions for them. There was also an incident where I wrote about the unjust circumstances of someone who claimed his money was extorted by a certain official, submitted it to his superior, and had that official dismissed. Because of this, the prison guards also feared me and could not arbitrarily mistreat the prisoners. In my spare time after teaching and writing documents, I had the prisoners sing pansori, traditional Korean narrative songs, and I also learned to sing and played along. Even though I grew up in a farming village, I didn't know a single tune of a weeding song or a single verse of the song of Chunyang. The prison rules at that time were different from now. They made prisoners take naps during the day and didn't allow them to close their eyes for a moment at night. This was out of fear that prisoners might escape while everyone was asleep. Therefore, prisoners were allowed to sing and read storybooks aloud all night long. This rule didn't apply to me, but because others did it, I naturally stayed up late playing before going to sleep. As I kept listening, I naturally came to appreciate the taste of sijo, traditional Korean poems, taryong, folk songs, and other songs sung by others, and I felt the desire to learn them too. I learned Pyeongsijo, Yokumsijo, Namchangjirum, Yochangjirum, Jokbyoka, Saitaryong, Geguri Taryong, etc. from Jo Deok-gun and joined in whenever others sang. 12th, crisis of execution and King Gojong's edict to suspend the execution. While this was going on, time passed, and July was almost gone. One day I saw an article in the Hwangsong Sinmun stating that Kim Chang-soo, a robber-murderer held in Incheon Prison, along with a few other murderers and robbers, would be executed by hanging on a certain day. The date was something like the 27th of July. When a person faces such an event, they might intentionally feign a calm demeanor, but for some reason, my mind was not shaken in the slightest. Even with barely half a day left before climbing the gallows, I was eating, reading, and conversing just like any normal day. I thought this was the influence of hearing from Teacher Go, the story of Park Tae-bo, who, while being tortured with red-hot plowshares, said, "This iron has cooled, heat it up more and ring it," and the historical account of the 3 learned men, Samhaksa, who were taken captive to Qing China. People who saw the newspaper article about my impending execution came one after another to say their final goodbyes and shed tears. It was, so to speak, offering condolences. People called Your Excellency or Sir also came, wiped away tears with both fists, and left, saying, "Kim Soksa, scholar, I thought you would come out alive and we would meet again. What is the meaning of this?" But the strange thing was that my mother, who brought my meals herself, showed no difference from her usual self. I supposed people had not informed her that I was about to die. Even after the condoling guests had left, I was reading the Great Learning as usual. I knew that executions of Incheon prison convicts were always carried out in the afternoon, and the location was Ugak-dong, so I ate a hearty breakfast and lunch. I didn't even have the mind to mentally prepare for how I should behave when dying. Even though I was so unfazed, the sorrow shown by the other prisoners, the disciples I taught, and the petty criminals who received my petitions and guidance for their lawsuits was so earnest that one might doubt if they would mourn as much at their own parents' funerals. Time gradually passed, afternoon came, and evening arrived. The time to be dragged out to the gallows was drawing closer by the minute. With the thought of immersing myself in the words of the sages and accompanying them until the moment my breath stopped, I sat with a proper posture and was reading the great learning. Somehow, dinner was brought in. People thought that because I was a special prisoner, the execution would be carried out at night. I had unexpectedly eaten one more evening meal in this world. Early in the evening, there was a loud commotion outside, the sound of several people approaching, and the noise of the prison gate opening. I thought, right, the time has finally come, and sat quietly waiting for them to come. The prisoners sharing my cell all turned pale and were trembling violently, as if they themselves were going out to die. At this time, a voice from outside the door was heard. "Which room is Chang-soo in?" My answer, "I am in this room," didn't even seem to be heard. And before the door even opened, a voice cried out, "Oh my, Chang-soo is alive now! Oh my! The superintendent, all the clerks, and the staff of each office haven't been able to eat a spoonful of rice since morning, just agonizing inside. How could they bear to kill Chang-soo with their own hands? But just now, His Majesty the Great Monarch summoned His Excellency the Superintendent to the main hall, and he received an imperial edict personally handed down to suspend the execution of Kim Chang-soo. We came after receiving the order to go down to the prison even in the night and convey the royal command to Kim Chang-soo. How heartbroken were you today?" The officials rejoiced as if their own flesh and blood had just escaped death. This was the 26th day of the intercalary 8th month of the Byongjin year. I later learned that there were two extremely close calls in my escaping the death penalty and surviving, which were as follows. The Minister of Justice took the roster of several death row inmates, including my name, and entered the palace to receive the king's approval. His Majesty had approved them all, but one of the royal secretaries on duty saw that my crime was "avenge the Queen Mother" and found it strange. He took the already approved document back before the king. His Majesty immediately convened a royal council, decided to suspend my execution, and quickly called Incheon Superintendent Lee Jae-jong by telephone. Therefore, if those four characters, "avenge the Queen Mother," had not caught the royal secretary's eye, I would have become due on the gallows as scheduled. This was the first miraculous coincidence. Secondly, the telephone line Kanye, Ting Seoul and Incheon was opened just 3 days before the call concerning me was made. If the telephone connection between Seoul and Incheon had not been established, no matter how much those above tried to save me, I would have already been dead before the gracious command arrived. Then, a clerk from the superintendent's office followed and told me that the 32 wholesale merchants in the port of Incheon had circulated a notice agreeing that at least one person from every household should go to Ugak-dong to watch Kim Chang-soo's execution, each bringing 1 yang of brass coins to pool together as ransom for my life. If that wasn't enough, they decided the 32 merchants would cover the shortfall. The clerk relayed this story and concluded, "Anyway, Scholar Kim, you have survived now by the help of heaven. An order from the palace will come within a few days, so stay without any worries." And then he left. Now everyone clearly knew I had escaped execution. It was as if a spring breeze suddenly blew while frost had been flying. The prisoners, who had been trembling in fear at the sound of the prison gate opening, seemed to be overjoyed to the point of dying upon hearing this news conveyed to me. Beating the wooden stocks with the mallets used to weave straw shoes, they sang every song they knew, danced with joy, and clowned around, making it seem as though actors in blue clothes had staged a theater play. The prisoners arbitrarily interpreted my continued calm and unperturbed demeanor as me knowing in advance that things would turn out safely, and they made a fuss calling me an extraordinary person with foresight. Moreover, my mother remembered my words at sea, "I will not die, and seemed to think I was someone with special knowledge, and my father seemed to harbor similar thoughts. 13th. Kim Gojong's life-saving campaign. As rumors spread that Kim Chang-soo's execution had been suspended by the great monarch's edict, the people who had come to bid me a final farewell previously returned, this time not to offer condolences but to congratulate me. Because there were so many visitors, I laid down a mat inside the prison gate and received them for several days. Previously, they had only lamented my youthful righteous spirit, but upon seeing my execution suspended by royal edict, they guessed that sooner or later a royal summons would come down and I would become a noble figure, so people even began to flatter me in advance. This happened not only among the common people, but also among the officials. One day, a clerk from the superintendent's office brought a suit of clothes and gave it to me, saying this was sent by a man from Gangwon named Kim Gojong, a military commander of the provincial army, who had asked the superintendent to deliver it. He told me to change into these clothes and wait to meet Kim Gojong when he arrived. Soon a man came looking for me. He appeared to be around 40 years old and had a tough-looking face. Upon meeting, he didn't say much except, "Endure your hardships well. I am Kim Gojong," and then he left. When my mother brought dinner, she said that military commander Kim had visited my father, leaving cloth for garments for both my parents and 200 nyang to help with expenses, saying he would come again in 10 days. She asked, "What did you think of the gentleman when you saw him? From what I hear outside, they say he is a truly remarkable man." I replied, "How can you know a person well after just one look? But the things he does are something to be thankful for." The person who informed Kim Gojong about my situation was Choi Deokman, the head runner at the Incheon Prison. Choi Deokman was originally a servant of Kim's family. Kim Gojong's courtesy name was Gyeongdeok, and he was the son of a low-ranking official in Gangwon. After the French campaign against Korea 1866, when Regent Daewongun trained 3,000 warriors in Gangwon, built artillery forts all around the island, and established a national defense garrison, his appointment to manage the military grain storehouse was the beginning of his rise in the world. He had a bold and unrestrained nature, disliked reading since childhood, and devoted himself to gambling. Once, his parents locked him in a storeroom for several days to discipline him. When he went in, he hid a wooden gambling tile, and while locked up, he figured out various ingenious methods for gambling. Upon coming out, he made tens of thousands of gambling tiles, secretly marking each piece in a way only he could understand. He distributed these tiles to the various ports in Gangwon to sell to sailors, and he himself traveled from boat to boat gambling. Since the tiles used on every boat were made by Kim Gojong, he could read the marks on the pieces, and thus he won hundreds of thousands of nyang in a short time. With the money won from gambling, Kim Gojong bribed the clerks and runners of various government offices in Gangwon and Incheon, making them obey his commands. He also gathered many cunning and courageous vagabonds to form his own faction. Whenever any noble, no matter how powerful, committed an act contrary to reason, Kim would invariably teach them a lesson, either directly or indirectly. If a thief appeared in the village and a patrol officer came to catch the culprit, they would first ask Kim Gojong. If he told them to take the person, they did. If he told them to leave the person to him, the officers could not disobey. At the time, it was said there were two great figures in Gangwon, Lee Jeon-chang among the nobles and Kim Gojong among the commoners. Even the magistrate of Gangwon could not touch these two men. Upon hearing such rumors, Daewongun entrusted Kim Gojong with the heavy responsibility of managing military provisions. One day, the head runner Choi Deokman came to me and said that when Kim Gojong came to his house for a meal, he said he had to save Kim Chang-soo. He remarked that the high officials in the government these days had their eyes rusted with copper and could see nothing but money, so he would go home, sell all his family properties, take one of Kim Chang-soo's parents to Seoul, and launch a release campaign using any means necessary. About 10 days after Choi Deokman relayed this, Kim Gojong indeed came to Incheon and took my mother with him to Seoul. I heard later that Kim Gojong sought out Han Ju-sol, the Minister of Justice at the time, spoke about my case, and argued that only by saving such a person would many loyal and righteous patriots emerge, urging him to report to His Majesty and have me released. Haeju Sol inwardly agreed, but the Japanese minister Hayashi Gonsuke had already made an issue of the fact that Kim Chang-soo hadn't been killed and was trying to harm any minister who defended Kim Chang-soo by any means possible. Since Han adamantly refused to report to His Majesty, Kim Gojong became furious, hurled countless insults at the high officials, and officially submitted a document to the Ministry of Justice demanding Kim Chang-soo's release. Only then did they reply, "His righteousness is commendable, but the matter is grave, so we cannot act as we please here." Even after that, he submitted second and third petitions to the relevant government offices, but everywhere was the same, passing the buck back and forth without reaching a conclusion. In this manner, Kim Gojong spent 7 or 8 months pursuing lawsuits for my sake, completely squandering his family fortune. My father and mother also took turns traveling back and forth between Incheon and Seoul, but ultimately, without any effect, Kim Gojong finally ceased his campaign for my release. Having given up on the lawsuits, Kim Gojong returned home and wrote a letter to me. After the usual words of comfort, he wrote a poem at the end. "A bird is only a good bird when it escapes its cage, and how can a fish be ordinary once it breaks free from the trap? Loyal subjects are surely found in families with filial piety, and filial sons can be seen in the homes of commoners." This was advice urging me to break out of prison. I replied expressing my gratitude for his devoting his heart and strength for my sake over that time, but stated that I had no intention of throwing away the light of honor, which is heavier than life, just to seek a cowardly way to live, so he should not worry. Later, Kim Gojong gathered comrades and hijacked one of the 3 government ships, preparing to become a pirate. However, his plan fell apart when it was discovered by the Gangwon magistrate's spies, and he fled. It is said that he encountered the magistrate's procession while fleeing, beat the magistrate severely, and then headed toward Vladivostok, or that he was hiding somewhere nearby. After that, my father took all the litigation documents Kim Gojong had submitted to the government offices in Seoul, sought out Lee Gyeon-chang in Gangwon, and asked for a plan to rescue me, but it is said he too could only sigh and lament. 14th. Decision to break out and escape from Incheon Prison. I continued my life in prison as it was. I diligently studied the new learning. Leaving everything to the will of heaven and wishing to walk alongside the sages, my resolve remained entirely unchanged, so I had no thought of breaking out and escaping. However, Jo Deok-gun, who had been sentenced to 10 years, Kim Baek-sok, Yang Bong-gu, who received a 3-year sentence, and a lifer whose name I forget, occasionally hinted at breaking out when things were quiet. They seemed to think that if I only wanted to, I could grab several of them in one hand and fly through the air to save them. As they continuously begged me with tears to save them, my heart began to move. Their thought was that I would soon be freed by a gracious order from above and become highly esteemed, but if even I left, how would they survive? I pondered. It is clear from His Majesty's personal edict suspending my execution that he does not consider me a criminal, and isn't it evident that our compatriots want me to live, starting with Kim Gojong and the wholesale merchants of Incheon port pooling money to buy my life? Everyone from top to bottom wants me to live, but the only reason they cannot release me is because of the Japanese bastards. If I were to die in prison, it would only please the Japanese bastards, so even if I break out of prison, it would not violate righteousness. Thus, I made the decision to break out. When I told Jo Deok-gun of my decision, he rejoiced as if he had already been saved and swore to do whatever I commanded. I told him to send word home to bring in 200 nyang of money, and he passed the message through the person who delivered meals, bringing it in immediately. With this, one preparation for the breakout was completed. Secondly, there was a major problem, bringing a Gangwon man named Hwang Sun-young under our control. Having almost completed his 3-year sentence for theft, his release date was not far off, so according to prison customs, he held the duty of supervising the other prisoners. Without getting this bastard in our hands, the plan could not work. However, Hwang had a weakness. He deeply loved Kim Bak-sok with a homosexual affection. Kim Bak-sok was a handsome youth of 17 or 18, a three-time repeat thief who had received a 10-year sentence and had been serving it for about a month. I decided to use Kim Bak-sok to get Hwang under my control. I had Jo Deok-gun incite Kim Bak-sok to pester Hwang so that Hwang would beg me to let Kim Bak-sok escape with me. The stratagem worked. Hwang begged me to release Kim Bak-sok. I sternly rebuked him and ordered him never to speak such sinful words again. But, constantly nagged by Kim Bak-sok, he begged me several times a day with tears. The more I rejected him, the more earnest his pleas became. Once, Hwang cried, saying, "I will serve his sentence in his place. Please just save Bak-sok." Even if it was a dirty affection, the power of affection was indeed great. Only then did I pretend to listen to Hwang's plea and granted permission. Hwang bowed 100 times in gratitude and rejoiced. Thus, the second preparation was finished. Next, I asked for a visit with my father and requested that he bring in a triangular iron spear about a foot long. My father caught on immediately and brought it in that evening, wrapped in a new suit of clothes. Now finally we set the date for the breakout, the 9th day of the 3rd month of the Musul year, 1898. That day I gave 150 nyang to Kim, the prison guard on duty, asking him to buy rice, meat, and a barrel of liquor, saying I would treat the prisoners tonight. I separately gave 25 nyang to the guard and told him to buy and smoke opium with it. This was because I knew guard Kim was an opium addict. Because I had treated the prisoners more than once or twice before, the guard took it as a normal occurrence, and more than anything, he was so happy about getting 25 nyang for opium that he did everything I asked without a word. Both the officials and prisoners believed I would sooner or later become noble through a royal grace, so no one ever dreamed I would break out and run away. Even the 4 men, Jo Deok-gun, Yang Bong-gu, Hwang Sun-young, and Kim Bak-sok, thought I would just stay in prison and only help them escape. When my mother brought my dinner, I told her that her son would leave the prison tonight, so she should catch a boat back to our hometown this very night and wait for me to find her. The 50 convicts and 30 unconvicted prisoners filled their hungry stomachs with meat, soup, and liquor, and were full of drunken merriment. I asked guard Kim to go around the rooms and let the prisoners sing and play. Kim was pleased and said, "You guys, sing songs to your heart's content as Mr. Kim wishes," making a show of granting a favor, and then went into his room to smoke the opium, which he liked better than singing. I walked back and forth from room to room, then quietly slipped under the wooden floor, used the spearhead to lift the bricks laid on the ground, dug through the earth, and emerged outside the prison. After securing a rope ladder to climb over the prison wall, a different thought suddenly occurred to me. I didn't know what might happen trying to pull others out. Maybe I should just leave by myself right now. Those guys aren't good people anyway. What use is it to save them? But I quickly reconsidered. If a person sins against a good person, it is shameful. How much more so if I become a sinner against such sinners? How could I stand under heaven and walk on earth? It would be a lifelong disgrace. I crawled back into the hole I had come out of and nonchalantly sat back in my spot. They were still engrossed in their merrymaking. With a glance, I called Jo Deok-gun's group one by one, told them the way out, and sent them all out. Being the 5th to come out, I saw that the 4 rascals who went out first hadn't even thought of climbing the wall, but were gathered in a huddle at the bottom, trembling in fear. I boosted them up by their buttocks one by one and sent them over the wall. Just as I was about to climb over last, the guys who went over first made noise while climbing the wooden fence. The police headquarters and patrol office, thinking an incident had occurred, blew whistles for an emergency assembly, and the sound of people running hurriedly could already be heard outside the prison gates. I was still standing under the prison wall. Since I couldn't return to my room now, the only option was to run away quickly. But while it was easy to boost others over, it was difficult to climb a wall that was more than 1.5 times a person's height alone. I didn't even have time to clumsily climb over with the rope ladder by myself. The sound of the prison gate opening and the prisoners clamoring reached me. Leaning on a long pole used by prisoners to carry water buckets together, I propelled my body upward, hooked my hands on the top of the wall, and leaped over to the other side. With things having come to this, I resolved to fight to the death with anyone who blocked my path. Instead of climbing the wooden fence, I took my iron spear in hand and walked straight out the main gates. The policemen guarding the gates seemed to have joined the emergency assembly, as no one was there. I walked out onto the open road. I had escaped Incheon Prison 2 years after being imprisoned. How did you listen to the story of young Kim Chang-soo, who remained resolute even at the threshold of death? I hope that his heart, which did not waver even in the harsh wind, has brought a little comfort and peace to your weary hearts tonight. That is all for the story I have prepared today. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like, and set notifications. Your small support becomes the strength for us to bring deeper and warmer stories. I hope you have deep and peaceful dreams tonight as well. This was Slow Night, Ancient Tales. Good night.